It was the kind of July evening where the air held its warmth long after the sun dipped below the rolling fields. Lancaster County moved at its usual pace, slow, deliberate, unchanging. But 3 days earlier, something on the Stoltzfus property had stopped moving entirely. Across the gravel road, a neighbor named Ruth King had noticed the same row of dresses and shirts hanging from the clothesline day after day. In Amish life, that wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Laundry was brought in within hours of drying. By the third night, Ruth decided something was wrong. She hitched her buggy and made the short ride to the Stoltzfus farm, pulling up to a silent yard where not even the chickens seemed to stir. She knocked on the front door. No answer. Peering through the window, she could just make out the kitchen table, a loaf of bread, a plate, something in a pot. It was the same scene she would later describe to deputies. It looked like they had just stepped away and never came back. By the time local authorities arrived the following morning, the air was thick with humidity and something else, a faint, acrid smell like wood smoke lingering in a closed-up room. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the supper Ruth had seen was still there, untouched, the bread hard as stone, milk in a pitcher starting to sour. A pot of beans sat on the stove, cold, but with the lid still on as if waiting to be served. In the living room, the family Bible rested open on a side table. Upstairs, 3 neatly made beds held no signs of recent use. The barn offered no more answers. The family's only buggy was inside, harnesses hung neatly on the wall, and Eli's tools lay in perfect order on the bench. Their draft horse stood in its stall, stamping at flies. A deputy noted that nothing looked stolen, nothing was broken. But that smell, wood smoke, still clung faintly in the kitchen, though the stove was cold and there was no ash in the firebox. The Stoltzfus family had lived here for generations. Eli was 39, a quiet man known for his skill with carpentry. Miriam, 36, was often seen at market selling quilts. Their children, Samuel, age 12, Leah, 9, and little Daniel, 6, were described as polite, shy, and rarely away from their parents. They kept to themselves, as most Amish did, but there had never been trouble. The sheriff's office knew from experience that working with the Amish community meant moving carefully. Outsiders were tolerated, but trust was hard won. Even now, the bishop of their district stood in the yard, speaking quietly to deputies, emphasizing the need for discretion. Reporters were told to leave. No one wanted English eyes peering into Amish grief. But as word spread, a low unease settled over the community. Neighbors began whispering theories among themselves. An accident, perhaps, a wagon mishap, a family emergency. Yet if that were true, why was the buggy still here? Deputies fanned out, checking outbuildings, the small orchard, the creek that bordered the north pasture. In the garden, rows of vegetables were beginning to wilt from lack of tending. Chickens had been without feed for days. These were not signs of a family planning to return. But there was no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a violent struggle. One odd detail stuck with the sheriff's deputy on scene. The back door was ajar, but its latch unbroken. On the porch, faint scuff marks in the dust seemed to indicate several people stepping in and out, but there was no clear direction of travel. The ground was hard-packed from years of use, making footprints almost impossible to read. That first day ended with more questions than answers. The sheriff ordered a preliminary search of the property line, bringing in a handful of volunteers to walk the fields. They found nothing, no dropped belongings, no wheel tracks beyond the usual farm use, no sign the family had left on foot or by buggy. As darkness fell, the only light in the yard came from the deputies' flashlights and the occasional lamp inside, where they continued to photograph the kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms, snapshots of a life paused mid-motion. Behind the guarded cooperation of the Amish neighbors was something else, something harder to name. A reluctance. When asked about the family's routines or any unusual visitors, answers were brief and vague. When the sheriff mentioned extending the search into the wooded tract north of the property, a few men exchanged looks and said quietly that the land beyond the fence wasn't theirs to walk. When pressed, they deflected. Later, one deputy would note in his report that it wasn't just privacy holding them back. It felt like fear. By the time the last deputy left that night, the Stoltzfus farm sat as it had for 3 days, silent, orderly, and empty. Somewhere between the moment supper was laid on the table and the neighbor's uneasy glance from across the road, an entire family had vanished without trace. And as the smell of phantom wood smoke faded into the humid night, one question began to take root, not just where they had gone, but what had been here with them before they left. By the second morning of the search, the Stoltzfus farm looked less like a quiet corner of Lancaster County and more like the staging ground for a county-wide emergency. Sheriff's deputies moved between the barn and the fence line, checking lists, marking maps. Mennonite neighbors arrived on foot, some carrying thermoses of coffee, others in work gloves, ready to join the effort. Even a handful of Amish men, hesitant at first, stepped forward to help comb the fields. But it was clear from the beginning that the search had invisible boundaries no one was willing to cross. The north fence marked the edge of the Stoltzfus property. Beyond it lay a dense stretch of hardwood forest, dark even in daylight, its undergrowth thick with brambles. The moment deputies suggested sweeping that area, several of the Amish volunteers exchanged uneasy glances. One older man muttered something about old ground, and the bishop, who had been speaking quietly with the sheriff, shook his head. The explanation was brief. The land was not theirs, and it had a history better left alone. No one elaborated. The sheriff couldn't afford to let folklore dictate the search. He assigned 2 deputies and a small group of non-Amish volunteers to push into the tree line. Scent dogs were brought in from a nearby county, straining at their leashes as they entered the shade. For the first 20 or 30 yards, the dogs moved with purpose, noses low to the ground. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. One whimpered. The handlers circled back, tried again from a different angle. Same result. The trail died inside the woods, as if whatever scent they'd been following had simply vanished. It was one of the volunteers, a Mennonite farmer named Joel, who spotted the bonnet. It was small, clearly a child's, pale fabric snagged on the thorn of a wild rose bush. The fabric was weathered but not yet discolored by rain or dirt, suggesting it hadn't been there long. Deputies photographed it in place before carefully removing it. Later, when shown to Miriam's sister, she said it looked like one Leah Stoltzfus had worn, though she couldn't be sure. Without hair or blood on the fabric, it offered no forensic lead. The rest of the wooded search turned up nothing. No footprints deep enough to cast, no discarded items, no sign of a camp or struggle. By late afternoon, the team emerged from the trees empty-handed, their boots scratched by thorns, clothes damp from the humidity. The sheriff noted in his report that the woods seemed strangely silent, though he stopped short of calling it unusual. In a rural area like this, silence was easy to explain. The air was still, animals stayed hidden, and any sound was swallowed by the trees. Over the following days, the search radius expanded outward from the Stoltzfus farm. Fields were walked shoulder to shoulder, the creek banks checked for signs of disturbance. Abandoned barns within a 5-mile radius were opened and searched. Flyers were distributed in nearby towns, though without photographs. The Stoltzfus, like many Amish, had none. Descriptions were simple. A man, late 30s, brown beard, blue eyes. A woman, mid-30s, brown hair, kind demeanor. 3 children, ages 12, 9, and 6. Investigators tried to build a timeline. The last confirmed sighting was on a Saturday evening, when Eli had been seen driving his buggy back from a neighbor's farm. On Sunday, the family missed church, an absence noted but not acted on until the laundry caught Ruth King's attention days later. There were no bank accounts to check, no phone calls to trace. The family had no electricity, no registered vehicle, and no recent purchases on record beyond what the general store might remember, and those records showed nothing unusual. As the first week passed, leads grew scarce. Rumors began to fill the gaps. Some neighbors whispered that the family might have been taken in a dispute over land, though no one could name who would do such a thing. Others speculated about a tragedy in the woods, a fall, a wild animal, though the complete lack of remains made it hard to believe. The Amish volunteers who refused to enter the North Woods said less and less to the deputies, as if speaking about it might invite something unwelcome. By the 10th day, the number of volunteers had dropped sharply. Deputies continued to make daily sweeps, but the once wide net began to shrink. On day 14, the sheriff held a brief press update. He confirmed that, despite an exhaustive ground search covering nearly 30 square miles, there was no sign of the Stoltzfus family. No ransom notes, no confirmed sightings, no trace beyond the child's bonnet. The case would remain open, but the active search was officially suspended. The farm returned to its stillness, the laundry long since taken down, the garden now choked with weeds. For those who had been there in those first days, the unanswered question hung heavier than the summer air, not just where the Stoltzfus had gone, but why the forest had been the one place no one wanted to look for them. By the winter of 1993, the Stoltzfus farm no longer looked like the place where a family had once risen before dawn to tend to animals and work the fields. Snow drifted against the doors, the clothesline sagged without use, and weeds had begun to choke the garden even in the cold months. No buyer had come forward. The property remained in legal limbo, technically owned by the Stoltzfus family, but without anyone to maintain it. From the road, it was just another empty farm in a county full of them. But those who had walked through it in the early days of the investigation knew it was something else entirely. A home frozen at the exact moment life had stopped. Deputy Harold Rupp, one of the first on scene that July, returned more than once over the next year. He remembered how, after the search teams had gone home, the kitchen cupboards were still full, jars of preserved fruit lined up in the cellar. Eli's tools were hanging exactly where they belonged. The buggy remained in its stall, the harness draped neatly over the beam. To Rupp, that detail was the hardest to shake. "When people leave, they take something," he would say later. "A change of clothes, a picture, a blanket. They didn't take a thing." In the absence of new evidence, theories began to fill the space the family had once occupied. One that surfaced quietly among a few locals and gained just enough traction to make it into the sheriff's files was that the Stoltzfus might have left on their own. Perhaps they had joined another Amish settlement, maybe to start over, maybe to escape something no one else knew about. But Miriam's sister dismissed it immediately. She explained that leaving without saying goodbye was unthinkable in their culture, not just rude, but deeply dishonorable. And even if they had gone, they would have taken the horse and buggy, their clothing, their quilts. Over the years, the farm became something of a local landmark. People driving by would slow down to glance at the weathered siding, the empty yard. Some, especially teenagers, dared each other to walk up the drive. A few went further, slipping into the unlocked house or the barn. It was from these trespassers that the stranger stories emerged. One group claimed they'd seen an oil lamp burning in the upstairs window late one night, though when deputies responded, the glass chimney was coated in dust, the wick brittle with age. Another said they'd heard the sound of a horse shifting in its stall, a sound Deputy Rupp swore he'd heard himself on a late-night patrol, yet the barn had been empty for years. Each report brought the sheriff's office back out to the property. Each time they found nothing. No footprints in the dust, no fresh hay in the loft, no sign anyone had been there since the day the search ended. And yet, the calls kept coming, often enough that the property was quietly noted as subject to trespassing activity in department logs. The bishop of the local Amish community asked that the building be locked, but without a legal guardian of the estate, the request went unanswered. By the mid-1990s, the farm had slipped fully into disrepair. The paint peeled from the siding, shutters came loose in windstorms, and the fields, once neatly furrowed, were overrun with wild grass. Inside, the stale smell of dust and mildew began to erase the scent of the lives once lived there. But certain objects seemed untouched by time. The quilt folded at the foot of a bed, the row of canning jars in the cellar, the work gloves still folded beside the barn door. Those who had known the family found it difficult to pass the place without feeling a hollow weight. It wasn't just that they were gone, it was that nothing had come in to take their place. In Amish tradition, an empty farm would be tended, rented, or passed to relatives. This one remained in limbo, as if any day now the Stoltzfus might return to reclaim it. For investigators, the lack of change became its own quiet kind of evidence. Whatever had happened to the Stoltzfus family, it had not been a hasty departure or a desperate flight. Their lives had been interrupted so cleanly, so completely, that even the smallest routines, bringing in laundry, feeding animals, blowing out a lamp, had been left unfinished. And yet, for all the stillness, there was always that undercurrent of rumor, fed by the occasional flicker of light or stray sound in the night. Each report was explained away, filed, and forgotten. But for those who had been there on that first July morning, the story served as a reminder that, abandoned or not, the Stoltzfus farm never really felt empty. Something about it held on, something about it waited, and sooner or later, someone would come along who couldn't ignore it. In the summer of 1995, 3 years after the Stoltzfus family had disappeared, the farm had taken on an almost mythic status among local teenagers. It wasn't just abandoned, it was untouchable, a place whispered about at bonfires and dared at sleepovers. That August, a group of 4 boys from the next township over decided to settle a bet. One of them claimed he could spend a full hour inside the barn after dark. The others would follow, just to make sure he didn't lie about it. They waited until after midnight, hitching a ride in the back of a pickup and parking a quarter-mile down the road before making their way to the property on foot. The barn, with its weathered siding and sagging roofline, was a darker shadow against the night sky. The heavy doors were closed but not locked. By then, scavengers had already carried off small tools, loose boards, anything easy to sell or repurpose. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, the floor littered with straw that had been rotting for years. Their flashlight beams cut narrow paths through the gloom, catching the glint of rusted nails, the cobwebbed corners of empty stalls. They were halfway across the main aisle when one of them noticed something odd at the far end, a section of the back wall where the boards didn't seem to line up quite right. The loose panel wasn't obvious at first. It looked like any other weathered plank, gray and split with age. But pressed at one edge, it shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap. The boys exchanged a look, then pried it open enough to slip through. Behind it was a cramped compartment, no larger than a closet. The air was stale, almost sweet with the scent of something long sealed away. In the beam of their flashlights, they saw 2 worn wool blankets folded in a corner, and beside them, a glass jar half filled with shriveled berries. The jar's lid was screwed on tight, the metal faintly tarnished but unbroken. It was an unsettling discovery. The blankets were old but intact, the kind of hand-woven ones Amish families often pass down through generations. The berries, elderberries it turned out later, were dried in the traditional way, the kind of food meant to last through the winter. The fact that they were sealed suggested someone had prepared them deliberately, as if for storage. There was no dust on the fabric folds, no rodent damage, no mold. The compartment had kept them protected from the elements. The boys didn't stay long after that. One claimed he heard a faint rustle from somewhere deeper in the wall. Another swore he saw a shadow move across the floor. They bolted, leaving the panel ajar. The next day, one of their parents called the sheriff's office, more out of concern for trespassing than the items themselves. Deputies arrived to inspect the barn, photographing the compartment and collecting the contents for testing. Forensics in 1995 offered little to work with. The blankets yielded no identifiable hair or fibers that could be traced. The jar was clean except for the berries inside, no fingerprints, no residue. Tests could not determine exactly when the berries had been dried or who had handled them. The lab reports noted only that the items were consistent with those used for temporary habitation. To the sheriff's office, that could mean anything, from a long-forgotten hiding spot to a makeshift shelter for a trespasser years after the Stoltzfus had gone. Still, the timing and location were enough to briefly revive the investigation. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, asking whether anyone had seen movement in or around the barn in recent years. Most said no. A few admitted they'd avoided the place altogether. One man claimed he'd spotted a faint glow inside the barn on a moonless night the previous fall, but he couldn't be sure. It might have been his imagination. With no new leads and no tangible link between the items and the missing family, the case once again went cold. By autumn, the county padlocked the barn doors to deter further trespassing. Officially, it was for liability. An aging structure on private property was a hazard, but unofficially, it was a way to keep the stories from growing. It didn't work. In the years that followed, rumors persisted. A group of hunters claimed they'd seen the silhouette of a man standing in the loft one night, staring out toward the fields. Others spoke of hearing the creak of floorboards when the wind was still, or the muffled sound of something shifting in the hay. No footprints were ever found in the dust, no signs of entry in the locks. The padlock itself remained untouched, yet the sense that someone, or something, still occupied that space refused to fade. For those who remembered the early days of the search, the discovery of that hidden compartment only deepened the unease. It was proof that the barn held secrets, maybe even that someone had lived there after the family was gone. But without evidence of who or when, it remained another fragment in a puzzle that was already more empty space than picture. And for every person who dismissed the sightings as nothing more than local lore, there was another who believed that, on the right kind of night, the barn still had someone inside, waiting. By 1998, the case file had thinned to a few reports and a box of photographs no one requested anymore. Walt Harmon, a retired state trooper who had worked the Stoltzfus disappearance his final year, kept a photocopy of the original scene inventory beside his notes. One omission tugged at him. Eli Stoltzfus was known for recording every expense in a handwritten farm ledger kept by the door, yet the Edetype inventory listed no such book. In farm life, it was a calendar, a balance sheet, a diary. If it existed, it might describe the family's final days with more honesty than memory. Harmon decided to look for it himself. He went to the sheriff's evidence room on a rainy Tuesday, and he asked to review the sealed boxes. A deputy checked out 3: kitchen, barn, miscellaneous. The first 2 held what the labels promised. In the third, under papers in a torn bag, lay a cloth-wrapped book the size of a Bible. The cover, stiff with age, bore indentations from use. Inside, the ink had faded to brown, but the handwriting was steady. For months it tracked seed purchases, harness repairs, egg sales, feed, lamp oil, ordinary entries written in Eli's neat hand. Near the back, the handwriting changed. At first the difference was subtle, tighter loops, strokes pressed harder, then unmistakable. The letters leaned as if the writer favored speed over care. 3 lines stood apart from routine. Heavy rope listed by length, lamp oil in quantities 5 times normal, and a final entry that read, "Extra feed for 2." There was no recorded change in livestock numbers, no sale, no foaling. The phrase didn't square with anything Harmon knew about the farm. Extra feed for which 2, and why now? He photographed the pages and brought the ledger to the county's document examiner, a cautious technician who had helped on check fraud cases. She wasn't authorized to open a formal analysis, but compared samples informally. Side by side, Eli's earlier entries and the last page showed different rhythms and pressure. She wrote one careful line for Harmon's notes. Indications suggest a second writer on late June entries. It wasn't proof, but it narrowed the question. If Eli didn't write them, who did? And why purchase rope in bulk oil days before a family vanished? Harmon visited the general store that supplied several Amish farms. The owner worked by memory more than receipts, but recalled a customer that summer who wasn't Eli buying rope and paying in coins from a cloth pouch. He described a hired hand who moved between farms and kept to himself, a man who repaired fence lines, slept in lofts, and left before dawn. The name came after a pause. Samuel Yoder. Harmon heard it again at a feed mill, and from a Mennonite farmer who remembered Yoder stacking hay 2 properties over. None had an address. Yoder stayed where he worked, then disappeared like weather. His name appeared nowhere in the original file. No interview, no note, not even a mention. Harmon searched county records and neighboring jurisdictions. There were no licenses, no phone listings, no taxes, only scattered references to casual labor from 1991 to 1993. An old Ohio incident log described a barn collapse in 1994 that allegedly killed a transient worker called Yoder, but no body was recovered. The report closed with a line about debris burial and no next of kin. If that Yoder was their man, he might already be dead. If not, he had slipped into a margin the system couldn't follow. Harmon pushed at what he had. Two people who had watched Yoder sign for seed said the ledger's last page looked like his hand, the lean, the pressure, but neither would swear under oath. The prosecutor declined to act on an unofficial comparison. There were no prints on the ledger, no witness placing Yoder at the Stoltzfus farm the week the family vanished, and no financial trail to trace. The rope and lamp oil could be explained a dozen ways. Extra feed for two remained orphaned on the page, suggestive and useless at once. Still, the ledger changed the posture of the case. It suggested a deliberate presence inside the family's routine, someone who could write in their book and expect not to be questioned. Harmon reboxed the ledger, logged its location so it couldn't go missing again, and added a memo naming Yoder as a person to be located. He called 2 Ohio agencies about the collapse, left messages, and waited. No one called back. Weeks turned into a season. The farm sank into weeds. The box returned to the shelf, its new label straight and clear. In the end, the file gained a name and a question heavier than evidence. Samuel Yoder, local laborer, last known early 1990s, whereabouts unknown. If he wrote those last lines, he had written himself into the center of the family's final days, and then walked away without a trace. The name sat there, ink drying, until something years later pulled it back into the light. By the summer of 2002, the Stoltzfus case had long since slipped from the front pages and into the quiet category of cold files. The farm was overgrown, the barn padlocked, and the name had become more of a cautionary whisper than an active investigation. But for Mark Weaver, a 24-year-old farmhand working the dairy circuit in the northern part of the county, that history was about to resurface in a way he couldn't ignore. It was a humid August afternoon when he was sent to check a damaged section of fence along the edge of a property bordered by dense woodland. The sun was low, cutting sharp light through the pasture, and Mark was halfway through replacing a warped post when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was the shadow of a deer, but when he turned, 2 figures stood just beyond the fence line, at the edge where grass gave way to the dark shade of the woods. They were children. Both wore plain Amish dress, the girl in a light bonnet, the boy in a straw hat, their clothes unmarked by logos or color. They stood side by side, perfectly still, watching him. Something in the way they held themselves, quiet and deliberate, made the hair on his neck stand up. Mark called out, not loudly, just enough to bridge the distance, but neither child moved. When he stepped toward the fence, they turned in unison and slipped into the trees without a word. He followed as far as the fence allowed, scanning the undergrowth for their path. By the time he reached the nearest gap, they were gone. No rustling leaves, no quick footsteps, nothing but the hum of insects and the faint smell of warm earth. He told himself it was probably nothing. Neighbor kids, maybe, from one of the scattered Amish farms in the area. But something about it wouldn't leave him alone. 2 days later, he was back in the same field, finishing the repair job. Near the tree line where he'd seen the children, a scrap of pale fabric caught his eye. It was a bonnet, snagged on a thorn branch. The ties were still knotted, as if it had been pulled straight from someone's head. Mark froze. In the years since his brief stint working for the Stoltzfus family as a teenager, he'd only thought about their disappearance in passing. But somewhere in the back of his mind, an old image came forward, the detail from a case file he'd once flipped through when a deputy stopped at the farm where he was working. A photograph of evidence, a child's bonnet, caught on a branch in the woods north of the Stoltzfus property, found during the first search in 1992. He picked up the bonnet, turning it over in his hands. The fabric was clean, no weathering from rain or sun. If it had been there long, it hadn't been exposed. It was as if it had been left recently, almost deliberately. Mark couldn't explain the unease that came with it, only that it felt wrong in a way he recognized, but couldn't yet name. That night, he found himself replaying the brief weeks he'd worked for the Stoltzfus family nearly a decade earlier. He remembered Eli's quiet manner, Miriam's soft voice, the way the children kept close to one another. He remembered the horse-drawn buggy rides into town and the stillness of the farm after dark. But he also remembered something else. One late afternoon in early summer, a man he didn't know walking the property line with Samuel, the eldest boy. The man had a slight limp and carried himself like he belonged there, though Mark had never seen him before. When he asked Eli about it the next day, Eli only said it was someone helping with repairs. Mark had forgotten that moment over the years, burying it under hundreds of other farm jobs and long workdays. But standing in that field in 2002, with a fresh bonnet in his hand and the image of those two silent children in his mind, the memory came back sharp. The way Samuel had glanced over his shoulder, the way the man had seemed to steer him toward the trees. For the rest of the week, Mark kept catching himself looking toward the tree line, half expecting to see the children again. They didn't reappear, but the air around that part of the field felt different to him now, watchful, as if the moment had left something behind. He didn't tell the dairy's owner right away, not knowing how to explain it without sounding like he'd let a stray thought get the better of him. But by the weekend, he decided it was too close to the old case to ignore. On Sunday evening, he placed the bonnet in a paper bag and set it on the passenger seat of his truck. The drive to the sheriff's office felt longer than it should have. Mark wasn't a man easily rattled, but he couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd seen was more than coincidence, that the pattern from 1992 hadn't ended at all. It had just gone quiet. And now, for reasons he didn't yet understand, it had surfaced again. Mark Weaver didn't go to the sheriff's office right away. For days after finding the bonnet and seeing the two silent children vanish into the woods, he wrestled with whether it was worth reporting. The Stoltzfus disappearance was a decade old, and most people he knew considered it unsolvable, a ghost of a case that had been picked clean years ago. But the memory that kept rising to the surface wouldn't let him dismiss it. It wasn't just the bonnet. It was what he had seen in the summer of 1992, a week before the family was gone. Back then, Mark had been a skinny teenager working odd jobs between farms. The Stoltzfus place had been one of them, a steady gig that lasted about a month. One evening, near dusk, he had gone out to put tools away in the shed when he noticed movement near the barn. Eli's eldest boy, Samuel, was walking alongside a man Mark didn't recognize. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with a broad frame and a pronounced limp. His clothes were plain but worn differently than the Stoltzfus family's, more work-stained, the sleeves rolled haphazardly. The two disappeared into the barn, and the door shut behind them. At the time, Mark hadn't thought much of it. Amish families often hired extra hands during busy seasons, and the man could have been anyone helping with repairs or tending animals. He didn't mention it to Eli or Miriam, and the memory faded into the blur of long workdays and changing jobs. But after the sighting at the dairy farm in 2002, when he spotted a man with the same gait, standing just beyond the property line in the rain, it came back with unsettling clarity. The limp, the heavy-set shoulders, the way the figure lingered without moving. When he finally sat across from a detective in the small, wood-paneled interview room, Mark spoke carefully, trying to recall every detail from both encounters. He admitted that if it weren't for the recent sighting, he might never have remembered the man from 1992. But now, the resemblance felt too strong to ignore. He described the limp, the work clothes, the fact that the man seemed to know his way around the Stoltzfus property. The detective listened without interrupting, jotting down notes before excusing himself. It didn't take long for the name to come back. Samuel Yoder. It was a name that had surfaced once before, buried in an unofficial handwriting comparison to the final entries in the Stoltzfus farm ledger. Yoder had been a seasonal laborer, working for multiple Amish families across Lancaster County and beyond. He had no fixed address, no phone, and no paper trail beyond cash transactions at feed mills and general stores. According to old county records, Yoder had left the area shortly after the Stoltzfus family vanished. The problem was, on paper, Yoder no longer existed. Ohio state records listed him as deceased, killed in a barn collapse in 1994. The structure had been condemned, and when it gave way during a storm, it supposedly buried him under a wall of rotting timbers. But there had been no autopsy, no formal identification. The report noted presumed death and closed the file after the property owner claimed no next of kin. The detective explained this to Mark, watching his reaction. Mark leaned back, absorbing the detail. If Yoder had died, it meant the man he'd seen at the dairy farm was either someone else entirely or a stranger, wearing a near-perfect likeness of a man gone 8 years. But Mark didn't believe that. The way the figure stood in the rain, just far enough to be out of reach, felt deliberate, like someone checking the edge of a boundary. Investigators reopened the Yoder angle quietly, contacting Ohio authorities to request any remaining files from the barn collapse. They also began reaching out to older Amish and Mennonite farmers who might have worked alongside Yoder, hoping for a recent sighting or even a rumor. Most gave little more than vague recollections. Some remembered the limp. Others recalled that he kept to himself, spoke little, and always seemed to know when to leave before questions were asked. One older farmer hesitated before adding, "If he's alive, he won't be where you're looking. He'll be where no one wants to go." The connection between Mark's sighting and the ledger's handwriting was circumstantial, but for the first time in years, the case had a living thread to pull. Whether Yoder had truly died in Ohio or staged his disappearance remained unanswered. The truth hung on a man who might have been buried under a collapsed barn, or might have been standing in the rain 10 years later, watching from the shadows. Mark left the station that evening with the uneasy sense that he had just stepped into something larger than a cold memory. The man with the limp had been near the Stoltzfus family in the final days before they vanished. Now, a decade later, he might be circling again. And if that was true, then the past wasn't finished. It was still moving, just beyond the fence line. The search warrant felt like a ritual more than a breakthrough, yet it put keys in locks that hadn't moved since the farm was sealed. At first light, deputies and a small forensic team crossed the yard and pried open the cellar doors. A draft rose that smelled of soil and preserved fruit. Steps were dusted with silt, and along the walls glass jars stood in ranks, glass filmed by time. Nothing looked touched, nothing stolen. It was the same stillness that had haunted every report. They swept the space methodically. Measurements, photographs. Mice had nested in a corner but left the shelves alone, and the packed floor was smooth. It wasn't the jars or the old coal bin that changed anything. It was a seam. Along the back wall, where the stone foundation met crude shelving, a pale line crossed the dirt like a healed scar. The lead investigator pressed his boot to it and felt a give that did not belong to undisturbed ground. What looked like earth behaved like a lid. They traced the outline, tested corners with narrow spades, and exposed a rim of board set flush with the dirt. 2 hidden handles showed as iron hoops. With 4 pairs of hands, the panel rose whole. Cold air breathed out, light went in. Beneath was a chamber the size of a small room, dug down and ribbed with rough planks. A fixed ladder of nailed 2x4s dropped into it. They entered carefully. The first boots touched a surface different from the cellar above, looser, sifted. The room was spare and deliberate. In one corner lay a child's wooden toy, 2 wheels on an axle and a push stick, its handle smoothed by use. Against the far wall, a woman's prayer cap had collapsed into itself, its ties tangled. Near the center, left as if in motion, were 3 shoes that didn't match, a small scuffed boot, a larger work shoe missing its laces, and a plain women's shoe with a cracked sole. 2 openings explained the room's purpose. On opposite walls, mouth-high to a crawling person, tunnels ran out. One faced north, toward the fence line and trees. The other angled southeast, toward the dried creek bed. Both were hand-dug, ceilings braced with scavenged boards and saplings. In the right-hand tunnel, a thin cord hugged the wall, frayed and brittle. In the left, the dirt was smoothed by elbows and knees. Air moved in both, cool, carrying leaf mold and stone. Processing went slow. The toy and cap were bagged first, then the shoes. Soil cores came next. The planks were swabbed. A mapper sketched the chamber and shot distances with a tape. Forensics later said the materials pointed backward. Cut timber matched growth rings from trees felled about 3 decades earlier. Insect casings and seams suggested long undisturbed construction. Mineral films fit years of damp, not months. It placed build and use in the early 1990s and did not contradict the family's timeline. They looked for the worst and did not find it. No bones in the floor, no stains that fluoresced, no hairs with intact roots. The toy's axle held a partial ridge that smudged under powder. The prayer cap yielded a few pale strands, too degraded for a nuclear profile, though a maternal line could be tested if one surfaced. The shoes resisted interpretation. Leather swells and shrinks, and whatever prints once lived in the insoles had loosened to ghosts. The evidence log grew dense and thin at once. The tunnels were explored, on pads and stomachs. The north branch scraped low under roots and pinched to a stop after 12 yards, the face ahead packed hard as brick. The creek bed branch ran longer. It dog-legged, opened into a crouch-high pocket, then narrowed toward shale. There, a single bent nail protruded from a brace like a hook, and in the dust below it a faint groove suggested a string had been tied there long ago. No prints, only the memory of use written in texture. Above ground, deputies paced bearings and marked likely endpoints. At the north line, a shallow depression lay beneath leaf litter near an old sinkhole that could have sealed in one wet winter. By the creek, the course widened and vanished into rock. A decade of freeze and thaw had erased what a month might have preserved. The best they could say was that both paths offered a way out that kept a body low and invisible until the land took over. By afternoon, the chamber was measured, photographed, and documented enough to be closed without rumor. The panel went back and was screwed down. In paperwork, it would be called a concealed subcellar with escape passages. In the quiet of the team packing cases, no one named it. Everyone felt what it was, a room to be gone while still present, to hear feet above, to wait until silence returned. When the last deputy stepped into the yard, the house looked the same as it had since 1992. But under the floor was a map drawn in dirt, and every line led away from light. The objects sat in evidence, timed to the right years and wrong distances. There were no remains to lift, only roots that pointed toward the woods and the creek and the distances beyond both. The search had reached back into the house and found motion. It had not found an end. The questions only multiplied from here. Detectives working the reopened Stoltzfus case began to notice a shift in their own language. It was no longer the disappearance. They started calling it one of the disappearances. The distinction came after a junior investigator, tasked with pulling every missing person report involving Amish families in the last 30 years, came back with 3 files that didn't belong to Lancaster County at all. The first was from rural Holmes County, Ohio, in 1984. The Hochstetler family, parents in their late 30s, 4 children under 12, vanished between a Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. Their horse and buggy were left in the barn, doors unlocked, supper cooling on the table. Neighbors assumed an illness had sent them to relatives, but no message came. When deputies searched, they found no signs of a break-in, no footprints leaving the property, and no evidence of violence. Months later, 2 boys in Amish clothing were reportedly seen standing at the edge of a soybean field a dozen miles away, staring at a passing car before walking into a wooded strip. By the time deputies arrived, the boys were gone. The second case came from Elkhart County, Indiana, in 1987. The Wagler family, smaller but nearly identical in circumstances, disappeared over the course of a single afternoon. Their youngest child was last seen playing in the yard around 3 o'clock. By nightfall, the house was empty. A neighbor doing evening rounds found the front door ajar, a butter churn mid-use in the kitchen, and a lantern still burning. A week later, a truck driver claimed he saw a woman and 2 children in Amish dress walking along a narrow trail near a rest area 20 miles south of the Wagler property. Like the Ohio sighting, it was never confirmed. On their own, each case was disturbing. Together, they were almost carbon copies of the Stoltzfus disappearance. No struggle, belongings untouched, sightings of children in plain dress near wooded or rural areas in the weeks afterward. When the team began checking for laborers or outside contractors working in those areas before the vanishings, one name came up in both cases: Samuel Yoder. In Ohio, he had been mending fences for a farm 2 properties over from the Hochstettlers. In Indiana, he'd been hired to help with a roof repair just a mile from the Wagglers. In Lancaster County, his handwriting had been unofficially linked to the final unusual entries in the Stoltzfus farm ledger. The connection might have been coincidence. Seasonal farm work was transient by nature, but the pattern of proximity was hard to ignore. And then there was the lingering problem of Yoder's death. Ohio state records still listed him as deceased in 1994, presumed killed in the collapse of an abandoned barn. But when Lancaster detectives requested the original report, they found the body had never been conclusively identified. Recovery teams had pulled debris and animal remains from the site, but no human remains that could be confirmed as Yoder's. With no dental records, no fingerprints, and no DNA profile ever collected, the declaration of death had been based solely on the property owner's word that Yoder had been inside when the barn came down. The implication was difficult to ignore. If Yoder hadn't died in 1994, he could have vanished just as completely as the families linked to his work. The theory forming inside the task force was as grim as it was incomplete. If he was alive, and if he was involved in all 3 disappearances, then Yoder had not simply killed. The evidence from the Stoltzfus property, the hidden compartment in the barn, the hollow root cellar with its tunnels, suggested concealment. But concealment for what? Theories spiraled in every direction. Some investigators thought he might have been hiding families as part of a breakaway Amish or off-grid community, moving them from place to place and keeping them cut off from the outside world. Others believed it was exploitation of some kind, though no one could point to solid proof. A smaller group argued that the sightings of children years later hinted at survival, children growing up in isolation, perhaps not even knowing they were missing. The problem was that every piece of evidence ended in a vacuum. The Ohio and Indiana homes had long since been resold, any trace evidence erased by time and renovation. Witnesses were older, memories less certain. In the Stoltzfus case, the bonnet found in 2002, the tunnels, the personal items, all pointed to occupation, but stopped short of naming when or by whom. Even the sightings were like the children themselves, visible for a moment, then gone into the trees. The task force drafted a summary report linking the 3 disappearances by circumstance, timeline, and Yoder's presence. It was the first official acknowledgement that the Stoltzfus case might be part of something larger. But without a living suspect, it was only a map with the same name written in 3 places. They sent it to the state police and the FBI, hoping for resources that might bridge the years. Inside the Lancaster office, the older detectives didn't need convincing. They had worked enough rural cases to know that sometimes patterns only became clear decades later, when someone finally lined up the dates and saw the same shadow fall across each one. And in this pattern, the shadow was a man with a limp, a history of vanishing between jobs, and a death certificate with no body. If Yoder was alive, he had been close to 3 families who disappeared without a trace, and in each case, the last real evidence was of children standing at the edge of a field, watching. Whatever had happened to the Stoltzfus family, the answer might not be buried in Lancaster County alone. It might be scattered across states, stitched together by a single pair of hands that no one had yet caught holding anything at all. By late 2002, the road from the dairy ran dark after evening milking, a straight 2-lane laid between corn and a narrow seam of woods. Mark Weaver drove it most nights with the window down and the radio low, trying not to dwell on the bonnet he'd turned in or the limping figure he thought he'd glimpsed weeks earlier at the fence line. The sheriff had thanked him, taken his statement, and said they'd keep eyes open. Weeks passed, the fields browned, the sky cleared early and stayed empty. Most nights felt like any other in farm country, quiet, routine, forgettable, until the rise in the pavement delivered a scene that would not let him forget. At the mouth of a side road stood two figures, fixed in his headlights as if arranged, a boy in a straw hat and plain suspenders, and behind him a taller man in old-fashioned trousers and broad suspenders, shoulders squared, unmoving. Mark slowed, then braked and rolled onto gravel. From the seat the distance looked short, 20 yards at most. Neither figure flinched. He stepped out and kept one hand on the door. The night held its breath. The taller figure shifted and the motion caught, an old, practiced compensation that sent weight heavy onto a right heel. Recognized it with a certainty that chilled him. The same limp he remembered from the Stoltzfus place as a teenager, the same he believed he'd seen near the dairy fence in the rain. The pair stepped backward together. No running, no stumble, vanishing into the corn as if the rows opened to take them. Mark crossed the ditch and followed, leaves rasping his sleeves, a faint brushed corridor curving toward the hedgerow. The woods beyond pressed the horizon into a black seam. He stopped short of the trees. Alone was one thing he would not be there. Back in the cab, he called the sheriff, gave the mile marker and the nearest mailbox number, and left his headlights fixed on the verge, afraid that moving them would erase whatever was left. Two cruisers arrived within minutes, domes dark, headlights low. Deputies worked the shoulder with flashlights held close to the ground, photographing disturbed weeds, broken tassels, and shallow impressions in the dirt. They followed the brushed corridor Mark had seen into the field. Two sets of prints pressed the soil, one small, one larger, the larger biting deeper on the right every other step. The trail arced toward the woods and ended 12 paces short of the tree line. Clean, abrupt. No further impressions, no jump to the next row, no drag marks, no ladder or board, just the last two shapes pressed neatly into earth and then undisturbed ground. They widened the circle. One deputy walked the hedgerow looking for ATV ruts and found only a shallow depression parallel to the field, the ghost of an old path filled with dry leaves. Another ran the ditch for tire tread and read nothing but scattered gravel. A third swept the first yards of woods and came back with burrs stuck to pant legs and no prints worth casting. In the beams, the scene delivered the same message three ways: approach, progress, termination. The deputies canvassed the nearest houses until midnight. No one was expecting visitors. One older farmer recalled an engine on the far road at dusk, quieter than a combine, smoother than a pickup, but could not place it. The Amish homes were dark. Word had already passed to avoid patrol cars and questions. Doors stayed closed. Back at the field they measured and poured plaster. The white pooled into the prints and hardened, catching the depth of that right heel and the small scuff at the child's left toe. A deputy labeled the casts and slid them into cardboard trays. The report language would be spare and careful, fresh impressions terminating abruptly. But on the ground, it felt stranger and nearer than those words allowed, an ending located precisely just out of reach. Mark gave his statement beside the truck, reciting what he had seen. The figures fixed in the headlights, the limp, the steady withdrawal into the corn. He did not add what he could not prove, that the moment felt offered, like a test to see who would follow and how far. He signed his name, watched the evidence go into a cruiser, and stood there while the field resumed its ordinary sound. In the days that followed, nothing broke loose. No father and son checked in at a clinic. No neighbor mentioned guests. The casts cured and went onto a shelf beside older evidence marked with other dates. The bonnet Mark had turned in weeks earlier looked less like an oddity now and more like a notice left where someone would eventually find it. Inside the sheriff's office, a new page went into the file with a single line that changed little and meant everything. Possible continuation of pattern. The sentence reached backward to 1992 and forward to whatever lay beyond the hedgerow. It did not name the man with the limp or prove that the boy had once lived in a house with a cellar room and 2 tunnels. It only fixed the route in memory. Road, verge, field, termination. Mark drove that stretch each night after, slower than before, checking the shoulder where they had stood and the corridor where they had slipped away. And he understood the part no report could hold. The pattern had not stopped at all.